Hello everyone who has come and listened. I am Jay. Today I would like to tell you a story. Live TV disaster. Host tries to corner Trump about Melania, ends in total humiliation. Please listen. The setup, the perfect trap. Tension begins. The bright studio lights cast a sharp glow over the sleek, modern set of the Rachel Sterling show. Millions of viewers across America were tuned in, expecting another hard-hitting interview, another viral moment. Tonight's guest? None other than Donald Trump. The network had been promoting this primetime event for weeks, teasing an explosive showdown between the former president and one of television's most aggressive liberal hosts. Backstage, Rachel Sterling adjusted the earpiece nestled beneath her perfectly styled hair. She wasn't just a journalist, she was a performer, a strategist, a master of the gotcha moment. Her team had spent weeks dissecting every angle, every possible line of attack. This wasn't just an interview, it was a trap. The questions were carefully designed, each one crafted to corner Trump, to force a reaction, to make him stumble on live television. The producers whispered final adjustments into her earpiece. Stick to the script. Don't let him take control. Meanwhile, Trump sat in the green room, relaxed but alert. He'd been in this position 100 times before. This wasn't his first hostile interview, and it wouldn't be his last. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting the crisp cuffs of his navy suit, his signature confidence unshaken. He knew what Sterling was trying to do. He had seen these tactics before, the polite smile masking the sharp blade underneath. A production assistant appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Trump, we're ready for you." He nodded, rising to his feet with an easy grace. As he walked down the corridor, past rows of monitors displaying the live feed, he caught a glimpse of Sterling sitting at her desk, reviewing her note cards. The expression on her face told him everything he needed to know. As he stepped onto the set, the applause from the studio audience was polite, measured, carefully curated to maintain the illusion of neutrality. He shook Sterling's hand, noting the brief hesitation in her grip, the carefully controlled tightness of her smile. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice smooth and calculated, "thank you for joining us tonight." The camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. The game had begun, and Trump, he was more than ready to play. The host's opening move, a calculated attack. As the cameras rolled, Rachel Sterling sat poised at her desk, her practiced smile barely concealing the sharp edge in her eyes. She thrived in moments like these. High pressure, high-stakes television designed to corner her guests, to push them into a verbal misstep that would fuel headlines for weeks. And tonight, she was confident. The questions had been meticulously designed, every angle considered. Donald Trump, however, remained unfazed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting casually on the armrest, his expression unreadable. He had been through this game before. He had faced tougher interviewers and more hostile crowds. What Sterling didn't realize was that she wasn't dealing with just another politician. She was dealing with a man who had built his career on dominating the room. Rachel glanced at her notes one last time before delivering her opening jab. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice measured and firm, "you've built an empire, served as president, and yet there are those who question the true nature of your success. Some say that without your wealth and privilege, you would have never made it this far." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Would you say you're just lucky?" The audience was silent, waiting. Some leaned forward, eager to see how Trump would react. The network executives watching from behind the scenes exchanged satisfied glances. This was exactly the kind of moment they had planned for. Trump, however, merely smiled. Not a smirk, not a nervous twitch, but a slow, knowing smile that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Luck," he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "You know, it's funny. People love to throw that word around when they don't want to acknowledge hard work." His voice was calm, steady. "Luck doesn't build skyscrapers. Luck doesn't create thousands of jobs, and it certainly doesn't make America great. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he looked amused. She pressed on, refusing to let him dictate the pace. So you're saying everything you've achieved is purely through hard work? Trump leaned forward now, his gaze locked onto hers. I'm saying that success isn't handed to you. I've had sleepless nights, impossible deals, challenges that would break most people. But here's the real question. He continued, his voice lowering just enough to draw the audience in. Why do people like you always try to discredit success? Why is it that when someone builds something, works for something, suddenly it's just luck? Rachel stiffened slightly. This wasn't the defensive response she had anticipated. She needed to regain control. She flipped to the next card in her stack, shifting tactics. Speaking of success, she said smoothly, many people wonder about the role of your wife, Melania, in all of this. She's often seen as distant, even disengaged. Would you say she's truly a partner in your success? The shift in topic was sharp, deliberate. The tension in the room tightened as the audience held their breath. This was the real trap. Trump's expression changed. Not anger, not annoyance, but something sharper. A flicker of something dangerous. Rachel Sterling had just stepped onto unstable ground, and she didn't even realize it. The trap is set. But who's really cornered? Rachel Sterling leaned forward slightly, her carefully manicured nails tapping against the glossy surface of the desk. The shift in topic had been subtle, but intentional. She had played this game before. Introduce an idea, let it simmer, then strike. And now she was ready to go for the kill. Mr. Trump, she began, her voice a perfect mix of curiosity and calculated skepticism. Many have speculated about Melania's role in your life. Some say she's distant, even uninvolved, just a quiet figure standing in the background. Do you think that's fair? Or is it simply a reflection of a relationship where one partner is perhaps overshadowed? A hush fell over the studio. The question had landed exactly as she had intended. Cutting, suggestive, a direct hit aimed at the very core of Trump's personal life. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Trump's fingers, which had been lightly drumming on the armrest, stopped. He inhaled slowly, letting the weight of the question settle over him before speaking. Distant, he repeated, his voice even, but laced with an underlying intensity. You think she's distant because she doesn't spend her time fighting for airtime? Because she doesn't parade herself in front of the cameras every chance she gets? He let the question hang for a moment, his gaze never breaking from Sterling's. Let me tell you something about Melania. She's strong, she's intelligent, and more than that, she's intentional. Rachel Sterling had expected some level of defensiveness, maybe even a dismissive remark. What she hadn't expected was the quiet force behind his words. Let's be honest, she said, pivoting slightly. There's an image that's been carefully maintained. Melania, the elegant, poised, but ultimately silent partner. Some would say that's not a reflection of strength, but of someone who's simply playing a role. Trump chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was something colder. The kind of laugh that sent a chill through the room. You know, Rachel, he said, his voice dangerously calm. It's always interesting when people, especially those in the media, talk about my wife as if they know her. You look at pictures, you watch 10-second clips, and suddenly you're experts on who she is. But tell me something. How many times have you actually sat down with her? Had a real conversation? Sterling opened her mouth, but Trump didn't give her the chance to respond. You see, he continued, leaning slightly forward, this is the problem with people like you. You don't report, you assume. You take a woman who has stood by my side through every challenge, who has endured attacks, who has been scrutinized by people who couldn't hold a candle to her strength, and you reduce her to a prop in some political drama. The audience was completely still now. The camera panned slightly, capturing the beads of sweat forming at Sterling's temple. She had pushed, and now she was realizing she had pushed too far. But she couldn't back down now. "I'm simply asking," she said, trying to regain control, "if you think it's fair that Melania, unlike past First Ladies, has remained so reserved. Some would argue that a woman in her position has an obligation to be more engaged with the public." Trump's eyes darkened. "Obligation," he echoed. "You think my wife owes the public her voice just because she married me? She's done more for this country than most of the so-called activists you people prop up. But because she doesn't stand on a stage, shouting slogans, she's distant? Because she carries herself with grace instead of indulging in political theater, she's not involved?" His voice had risen now, not in anger, but in sheer command. The kind of voice that didn't just demand attention. It seized it. The tension in the room was suffocating. Even the camera crew had gone unnaturally still. Rachel Sterling shifted in her seat, trying to maintain her composure, but she knew the moment was slipping. She had walked into this interview with the intention of trapping Trump, of making him stumble. Instead, she was the one feeling the walls closing in. She glanced briefly at the producer behind the cameras, who was frantically signaling her to pivot. But how? The question had been asked. The moment was already spiraling in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "You know," Trump said, his voice lowering slightly, a lethal edge to his tone, "it's funny how the media preaches about empowering women, but the moment they see a strong, independent woman who doesn't fit their narrative, they tear her down. My wife doesn't owe you anything. She doesn't owe this network or anyone else an explanation for how she chooses to live her life. She's not distant. She's discerning." Rachel swallowed hard. The entire interview had shifted. It was no longer about Melania. It was about the hypocrisy Trump had just exposed. And worse, the audience knew it. She had set the trap. But she was the one caught in it. The moment that changed everything. A host on the edge. Rachel Sterling felt the pressure mounting. The studio lights were suddenly too bright, her palms too damp, and the silence in the room was suffocating. The audience, the crew, even the producer in her earpiece. Everyone was waiting to see what she'd do next. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Research teams had dug through archives, scrutinized every interview Melania had ever given, and compiled a list of talking points designed to catch Trump off guard. Yet here she was, sitting across from him, feeling like the one under interrogation. Her strategy had been simple. Question Melania's role, suggest she was a passive figure in Trump's world, and watch as the former president fumbled to defend her. But that hadn't happened. Instead, Trump had turned the tables, exposing the hypocrisy in the media's portrayal of strong women. And now, Rachel felt like she was being watched. Not just by the audience, but by millions of people at home, waiting to see if she'd make her next move, or crumble under the weight of her own question. For the first time in her career, Rachel hesitated. She shifted in her seat, her fingers grazing the stack of neatly printed note cards on the desk. Each one held a lifeline, a carefully crafted question designed to steer the conversation back into her control. But none of them seemed useful now. If she pushed too hard, she risked looking desperate. If she backed down, it would be an admission of defeat. Trump watched her, waiting, not with impatience, but with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Rachel forced herself to smile, a well-practiced expression that had carried her through dozens of interviews before. But for the first time, it felt unnatural. "Mr. Trump," she began again, her voice measured but carrying the slightest tremor, "no one is questioning Melania's grace or intelligence. But some argue that the role of a first lady, or a former first lady, is about more than just presence. It's about advocacy, policy, taking a stand. Don't you think the American people deserve more from someone in that position?" Trump's jaw tensed slightly. His expression, which had been calm and composed throughout the interview, shifted. Not to anger, but something even more dangerous: conviction. "You see," he said, his voice low and firm, "that's the problem right there. You're not asking about Melania's work. You're asking why she isn't loud enough for you, why she doesn't fit the mold of what you think a first lady should be. And that's why people don't trust the media anymore." Rachel swallowed, feeling the heat rise in her face. Trump leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding. "You want to talk about advocacy?" he continued. Melania championed the Be Best initiative, focusing on children's well-being and online safety. She visited hospitals, schools, and communities without turning it into a media spectacle. And while some first ladies have used their platforms for self-promotion, Melania used hers to actually help people. "But you won't talk about that, will you?" Rachel opened her mouth, but he didn't give her the chance. Instead, he pressed on, "You sit here, trying to convince the American people that my wife has somehow failed them because she isn't screaming on a stage or spending hours giving interviews to people like you. Well, let me tell you something, Rachel. Real impact doesn't come from making noise. It comes from action." The audience, which had remained eerily silent up until now, stirred. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Rachel's grip on her cue cards tightened. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and she was struggling to regain control. She could feel the producer in her earpiece whispering something urgently, but she couldn't focus on anything except the growing realization that she had lost. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Taking a breath, she straightened in her seat and forced another smile. "With all due respect, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice carefully composed, "you can't deny that Melania's absence from the political stage has led to speculation. People want to see more from their first ladies. They want to feel connected." Trump let out a small, almost amused exhale. "Speculation," he echoed. "That's an interesting word. The media loves speculation, don't they? You speculate about my marriage, about my wife's decisions, about her presence or absence. But you know what you don't do? Report the facts. Tell me, Rachel, how many times have you covered Melania's work with foster care programs, her visits to wounded soldiers, her efforts to combat cyberbullying?" Rachel's lips parted slightly, but Trump didn't need an answer. "You haven't," he said simply. "Because that doesn't fit the story you want to tell. You want a headline, you want controversy, and when you don't get it, you manufacture it." The tension in the studio reached its peak. Rachel Sterling, one of the most seasoned interviewers in the business, was trapped. She had walked into this interview thinking she had the upper hand, thinking she could steer the conversation in her favor. But now, she realized she was the one being exposed. The cameras captured everything. The flicker of doubt in her eyes, the slight tremble in her hand, the way she struggled to maintain her composure as Trump dismantled her argument with brutal efficiency. And the worst part? The audience saw it too. The turning point, a battle of wits and will. Rachel Sterling felt the sweat gather at the nape of her neck. She could hear the whispers in her earpiece, frantic producers urging her to pivot, to take back control of the interview before it spiraled completely beyond her reach. But how? Every attempt to corner Trump had failed. Every question, every well-rehearsed jab had been effortlessly deflected or worse, turned back on her. The cameras were rolling. The audience was riveted. Millions were watching from their living rooms, their phones, their tablets, waiting to see if she would crumble or fight back. Taking a measured breath, she forced a composed expression and leaned in slightly. Her voice low, calculated. "Mr. Trump, let's not pretend that media scrutiny is something new to you or your family. You have built an empire on attention, on being in the headlines, and yet, when the questions don't favor you, suddenly it's the media's fault?" Trump's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked amused. "Rachel, There's a difference between reporting facts and manufacturing narratives. Your network, along with many others, has made a sport out of twisting reality to fit an agenda. You don't ask me about policy. You don't ask about Melania's actual work. No, you sit here and ask why she isn't a loud, attention-seeking activist like the people you prefer. And that's exactly why people don't trust the media anymore. Rachel clenched her jaw. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension in the room rise to an almost unbearable level. She had one last angle, one last shot to regain control. It was risky. If it worked, she might just salvage this interview. If it backfired, it could become the most humiliating moment of her career. She adjusted the papers on her lap, taking care to look unaffected. "Since we're discussing trust, let's talk about the elephant in the room," she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "Your marriage." The room went silent. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Even some of the crew members exchanged glances. They all knew this was the line, the moment she had been waiting for. Rachel continued, her tone carefully neutral, though her words were anything but. "There have been rumors for years, Mr. Trump. Whispers of distance, of separate lives, of, let's say, temptations. Some have suggested that Melania's reluctance to be in the public eye has less to do with privacy and more to do with discontent, that perhaps she's enduring rather than thriving. Would you care to address that?" For the first time in the interview, Trump's expression hardened. The air in the studio thickened, like a storm gathering strength just before it broke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his piercing gaze locking onto Rachel's, with an intensity that sent a shiver through the room. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but laced with unmistakable fire. "You know, Rachel, I expected this," he said. "I knew that at some point you'd try to make this personal. That's what your network does, right? You can't beat me on policy. You can't challenge my record, so you go for the cheap shot." Rachel tried to hold his gaze, but something in his tone made her stomach twist. Trump continued, his voice rising just slightly, commanding the full attention of every person in the room. "Let me tell you something about my wife. She is the most intelligent, most graceful, most loyal woman I have ever known. And let me tell you something about loyalty, Rachel, since that's a concept I'm sure is foreign in your industry. Real loyalty isn't about constant public appearances. It's not about playing the media's game. It's about standing by your partner through everything. Through the highs, through the lows, through the attacks, through the lies." Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. Trump's voice grew sharper. "You sit here and throw out rumors, trying to get a rise out of me. But let me ask you this. Where were you when Melania was visiting wounded veterans, comforting sick children, working behind the scenes to make a difference? Where were you when she was being torn apart by your own media, called every name in the book, insulted for simply being my wife?" Rachel opened her mouth, but Trump wasn't finished. "You talk about whispers and speculation," he said, shaking his head slightly, a look of almost pity crossing his face. "But you know what's funny? The only people who talk about my marriage like that are the ones who have no idea what a real marriage is. The ones who trade partners like stock options. The ones who think loyalty has an expiration date." The audience erupted in murmurs. Trump sat back, exhaling sharply. "So no, Rachel, I don't need to address rumors. Because the truth is simple. Melania and I are stronger than any headline, any gossip column, and certainly stronger than a desperate question from a floundering journalist." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's face burned. She had been outmaneuvered at every turn, but this was something else. Trump hadn't just countered her question. He had flipped it into an indictment of her and the entire media machine. The producer's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Wrap it up. Cut to break. Now." But Rachel couldn't move. She had underestimated him. Again. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of her hesitation, every flicker of unease in her expression. Trump leaned forward one last time, his final words like a closing argument in a trial he had already won. "You wanted your big moment, Rachel? Congratulations. You got it." And with that, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, waiting. The only question now was, what would she do next? The aftermath, a career-defining moment. Rachel Sterling sat frozen, her mind racing as the studio lights beamed down on her. The silence in the room stretched longer than it should have, each second amplifying the weight of what had just happened. The producer's voice crackled again in her earpiece. Cut to commercial, now. But she couldn't. Every camera in the studio was still locked onto her and Trump. Millions of viewers were waiting for her next move. She had planned for every possible scenario. An evasive Trump, an angry Trump, even an outright storm-off. But she hadn't planned for this. He had flipped the entire segment on its head, not only dismantling every question, but exposing the media's tactics in front of the world. And now, as he sat there calmly, watching her struggle to regain composure, she realized she had no good way out. Swallowing hard, she forced a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Trump, you certainly know how to command a room," she said, her voice only slightly strained. Trump tilted his head slightly, smirking. "Rachel, commanding a room isn't hard when you're just telling the truth." A ripple of murmurs went through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others sat in stunned silence. Even those who disagreed with him politically had to admit, he had completely controlled the conversation. Rachel exhaled slowly. She had one last card to play. If she couldn't defeat him, she could at least make it look like she had landed a hit. "So," she said, leaning forward with an air of forced confidence, "if the media is so terrible, why do you keep coming on shows like this?" Trump chuckled. He saw the desperation behind the question. "Because despite everything, people still deserve the truth," he said simply. "And let's be honest, Rachel, you need me more than I need you." The audience gasped. Rachel's composure cracked for the briefest moment. Trump continued, his voice steady, controlled. "That's why this interview happened, right? Because you knew the ratings would be through the roof. Your network needed a headline, and you thought you could create one at my expense. But let me ask you something, Rachel. How's that working out for you?" A hush fell over the studio. Rachel felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She was losing control again, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Trump leaned back in his chair, utterly at ease. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," he said. "Tomorrow morning, this interview is going viral. Not because you got me, but because you exposed everything people already knew about the media. You came in with an agenda, and when it didn't work, you scrambled. And now, the world sees it." Rachel inhaled sharply. She glanced at the cameras, realizing for the first time that she wasn't just losing a debate, she was losing credibility. The control room finally made the decision for her. "We need to take a break," she said hurriedly, barely able to mask the strain in her voice. "Stay with us. We'll be right back." The screen faded to black, but the damage was already done. By the time the show returned from commercial, social media had already exploded. Clips of Trump's responses were spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like #TrumpExposesMedia and #RachelSterlingMeltdown trended within minutes. Rachel sat at the desk, smiling tightly through the remainder of the segment, but her mind was elsewhere. She had walked into this interview expecting to corner Donald Trump. Instead, she had just witnessed the biggest miscalculation of her career. And as she stared at the cameras, she knew one thing for certain. This moment would follow her forever. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and leave comments for the story.